イギリスから来ました. If you can't tell why that just sounded off, you're not alone. Pitch accent is often overlooked by Japanese learners. Today, let's talk about the pitch accent of noun-dependent words in Japanese. Let's get started. Hey guys, welcome to Monochrome Japanese, a peaceful space where you can focus on your Japanese study. I'm your host, Shiho. If you've been watching my short videos, you've probably already come across some pitch accent patterns of noun-dependent words. For example, case particles like kara, yori, no, to, and adverbial particles like dake, made, hodo, or auxiliary verbs like desu, and so on. At the same time, you might have noticed that some of these noun-dependent words have very similar pitch patterns. For instance, kara and hodo, or made and yori, and so on. Exactly. Noun-dependent words can actually be grouped and understood as categories based on their overall pitch patterns. And that's what we'll explore together today. Before we start, let's quickly review a few concepts and define our scope. First, the term noun here is used in a broad sense. Besides words that are strictly nouns by part of speech, it also includes demonstrative pronouns and interrogatives from the kosoado group. Personal pronouns like watashi, and common interrogatives like nani, dare, itsu. Next, when we talk about noun-dependent words, the first thing that comes to mind is probably case particles, or at least various kinds of particles. But actually, it can also include auxiliary verbs like desu or mitai, or established forms made from combinations of particles and auxiliary verbs. For example, datta or demo. In short, anything that can follow a noun falls under this category. Finally, for convenience, we'll introduce two broader pitch accent categories: flat type and falling type. It's very simple. Flat type refers to the familiar flat or pattern A pitch accent, while falling type refers to patterns where the pitch drops. That is, any of the pattern B, C, or D. If you're not yet familiar with these pitch accent patterns, I strongly recommend watching my pitch accent patterns series or the fundamentals video first. Now let's dive in. First, we need to be clear about this. When it comes to pitch accent, a noun and its following dependent word are treated as one single unit. Because of that, to understand its pitch accent, we need to quickly review the two core rules of standard Japanese pitch accent, which I covered in the fundamentals video. Do you remember? Yes. Rule number 1. The first two moras are always different. Rule number 2. Once the pitch drops, it doesn't rise again. This second rule is especially important today. In other words, since a noun and its dependent word act as one unit, just like a single word, once the pitch falls, it doesn't rise again. That's a key point for understanding this video. Based on this, the pitch accent behaviors of common noun-dependent words can be grouped into two main types. Today, we're going to look at both types through examples. Ready? First, the follower. As the name suggests, this refers to cases where the dependent word's pitch accent is determined by the noun that comes before it. In the fundamentals video, we looked at the pitch accent of individual words and classified them into 4 pitch accent patterns, based on whether there's a drop of pitch, and if yes, where it occurs. But here, we're more concerned only with whether there is a drop of pitch or not. Because a dependent word's pitch accent is influenced by the noun primarily in this sense. That's why using flat type and falling type here makes things easier to understand. Let's start with the case where the preceding noun is flat type. Because the pitch doesn't fall, the dependent word that follows begins at a high pitch. Naturally, if the dependent word only has one mora, it ends high too. So the entire unit remains flat type. For example, 水を飲む. 水 is a flat type noun. So, お is pronounced with a high pitch. That's easy enough to understand. So let's move on to cases where the dependent word has 2 or more moras. If the dependent word is also flat type, then overall, the whole unit stays flat. For example, これほど美しい景色は見たことがない。これほど。Another example, 丸山先生は画家として活躍されているそうです。画家として。In such cases, more important thing is to make sure the dependent word itself doesn't have a falling pitch. For example, don't read it as ほど or として. Now, what if the dependent word is falling type? Since its first mora can be high, the pitch can fall anywhere within it, while mostly keeping its original pattern intact. For example, いつかお茶でも行きましょうか。お茶でも。Another example, 東京まで新幹線で2時間かかります。東京まで。Sounds natural, right? That's because so far we've only looked at cases where the preceding noun is flat type. Since such nouns end on a high pitch, the dependent word naturally has room for a pitch drop, if there is one. In other words, whether the dependent word is flat or falling type, it can maintain its natural or original pattern. Now let's move on to when the preceding noun is falling type. This is not too complicated either, but it's easy to overlook. Let's see why. Since the pitch already dropped, the dependent word begins low. If it has only one mora, it simply stays low. Most people won't mispronounce dependent words in this case, even if the noun has 3 or more moras as a pattern C word. So I'll just skip the examples. But, as we've discussed before, when the noun is in pattern D, it requires our attention. You probably still remember this example, so I won't explain again. Now, let's see what happens when a falling type noun combines with a dependent word of 2 or more moras. If the dependent word is flat type, then clearly you just stay low. For example, 地図から見ると山に囲まれているようです。地図から。Similarly, when the noun is in pattern D, we also need to pay attention. 店から出たら雨が降っていた。店から。But what if the dependent word is also falling type? Can we just connect them like this? If you still remember this rule, you know the answer is no. So if both sides need to keep their pitch drops, but overall the pitch can't rise again, what do we do? Exactly, we make it drop twice. However, according to this dictionary, the second drop is smaller in range than the first. Let's take a look at an example of 2 plus 2 morris just like this. こう頑張っていけば今より上手くなるよ。今より今より Another example. 会議が2時までだったからお昼はまだだよ。2時まで2時まで Also, this same dictionary clearly mentions that when the preceding noun is in pattern D and the dependent word is in pattern B, the dependent word's pitch accent can also disappear. For example, 親すら信じてくれなかったら辛いよね。親すら親すら Alright, if we summarize the 4 combinations we've discussed so far, it looks like this. The upward symbol represents the flat type, the downward one for the falling type. If you've watched my previous videos, I'm sure you can draw out combinations of specific pitch accent patterns yourself, as well as for longer words of 3 morris or more. I encourage you to give it a try. And again, pay special attention when the noun is in pattern D. That's it for the follower. Now let's move on to the second type, the leader. As you can guess, this is the opposite of the previous one. In other words, the dependent word determines the noun's pitch accent. And this kind of determining is actually simpler than the first type, as it usually means that a falling type dependent word changes the preceding noun into a flat type. The most typical example is the suffix らしい, meaning befit, be like, or having the typical characteristic. 今日はポカポカしていて春らしいですね。春らしい春らしい Notice, however, that the auxiliary verb らしい used for hearsay, guesswork, or supposition is a follower type. あの店最近すごく人気があるらしいよ。あるらしいあるらしい So those are the 2 main pitch accent types for noun-dependent words. Now let's go back to the sentence we started with. I pronounced it as イギリスから来ました. Let's take a look at this case particle から. I actually mentioned it in this short video, that when pronounced alone, it's から. But when it follows a noun, it's actually a flat type follower dependent word. In other words, if the preceding noun is also flat type, then both morris are pronounced high. イギリス happens to be flat type. So the correct pronunciation is イギリスから来ました, not イギリスから来ました。イギリスから来ました。Okay, let's also review today's content with a simple quiz. I'll pick one sentence from each of these 9 short videos and read them in sets of 3. In each set, one of the noun-dependent words has a wrong pitch accent, and your task is to find it out. Ready? Let's go! 今日から学校に通い始めます。東京まで飛行機でどのぐらいかかりますか？今年は去年より暑いですね。The まで here sounds off, right? It's a falling type dependent word, pronounced high, low. And since the preceding noun 東京 is flat type with no pitch fall, the two connect smoothly. 東京まで not 東京まで Good. Let's continue. これほど美しい景色は見たことがないな。それは社会的マナーとして当然のことだ。俺と居酒屋に行くけど、彼女はあんまり飲めないんだよね。The と here is the odd one, right? One more dependent words like this usually follow the noun's pitch accent. Here, 俺, just like 私, is flat type. So, と should be high. 俺と Alright, the last set. 一人の男性がギターを弾いていた。去年日本に来た留学生です。自分たちの意見をもっとはっきり伝えるべきだ。The last one, 自分たち is incorrect. The suffix たち is pronounced low. And since 自分 ends with a special mora, the syllabic nasal here, 自分たち is also incorrect. The correct pitch accent is 自分たち. How was that? Did you catch them all? I strongly recommend you try reading these sentences out loud. Besides checking the pitch accent of these noun-dependent words, you can also test whether you're fine with these ones too. And lastly, a quick reminder, the と らしい here have different pitch accents. Try reading them aloud. If you want to learn more about pitch accent of dependent words, check out this series of my short videos, which I'm updating on weekdays. Alright, that's all for today. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please subscribe to my channel and share this video with anyone you know that's learning Japanese or just interested in this language. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.